I bought the cabin 3 years ago. It was a small, old thing, sitting deep in the woods about 20 miles outside of town. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed living around too many people. Something about crowds always made me uneasy. I liked silence. I liked being alone. The cabin had been cheap, mostly because no one wanted it. The real estate agent warned me that it needed work. Rotting wood on the porch, a rusted-out water heater, and the insulation was barely enough to keep the place warm during winter. But none of that bothered me. I was good with my hands. I figured a few months of fixing it up, and I'd have the perfect little place to live in peace. The first year was fine. Hard work, long days spent chopping wood, sealing leaks, replacing old boards. I learned to live with the sound of the trees creaking in the wind, the distant howls of coyotes at night. But then, one morning in late fall, everything changed. I woke up to a smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint, musty odor, like something damp had been left out too long. I figured it was the woodpile. Maybe some of it had gotten wet in the rain. I ignored it, got dressed, and went about my morning routine, boiling water for coffee, stepping outside to check the traps I'd set overnight. By midday, the smell had gotten worse. It wasn't just musty anymore. It was sharp, sour, clinging to the back of my throat even when I breathed through my mouth. I checked the kitchen first. Maybe some food had gone bad. Nothing. The fridge was running fine. Then I checked under the sink, thinking maybe a rodent had crawled in and died. Nothing there either. By evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whole cabin stank like rotting meat. It was strongest near the back of the cabin, by the door that led to the small storage room. I hesitated before opening it. Something about the way the smell hung in the air made my skin crawl. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was dark. The single window was covered in dust, barely letting in any light. I reached in, fumbling for the pull string that turned on the bare bulb overhead. The light flickered weakly. Then I saw it. A body, sprawled on the floor, face down. For a second, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. The skin was gray, stretched tight over the bones. The clothes were damp, clinging to the shape beneath. I could see where the flesh had started to break down, dark patches spreading across the back. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. The smell was unbearable now. My first thought was, how did it get here? I lived alone. No one ever came out this way. There were no roads leading up to the cabin, just a dirt trail that I rarely used. Even hunters didn't bother coming this deep into the woods. And yet, here was a dead man in my storage room. I forced myself to step closer. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to touch him, but I had to see his face. I grabbed his shoulder and turned him over. His eyes were open, mouth slightly parted, like he'd died mid-breath. His skin was dark with bruises, lips cracked, fingernails blackened. But the worst part was his throat. A deep, jagged wound ran across it, dried blood caking his collar. Someone had killed him and left him here. I stepped back, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. I needed to think. The cabin had been locked. No windows were broken. That meant whoever put him here had a key, or they'd come in when I was gone and locked up behind them. That thought sent a cold rush through me. Had they been inside while I slept? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had to get the police. But my phone was useless out here, no signal, no Wi-Fi. The nearest place with a landline was a gas station, about 10 miles away. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and my rifle, just in case. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. The sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across the trees. I walked fast. The gas station wasn't much. A single pump, a small convenience store, the kind of place where people stopped for a soda or a pack of cigarettes on their way to somewhere else. The cashier looked up when I came in. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with a lined face and a cigarette hanging from his lips. I asked to use the phone. He didn't ask questions. The police arrived an hour later. 2 deputies, one older, one younger. They listened as I told them what I found. The older one, a guy named Daniels, nodded slowly, taking notes. The younger one, Mercer, didn't say much, just kept glancing at the rifle slung over my shoulder. They followed me back to the cabin. By the time we got there, it was dark. I unlocked the door and stepped inside first, my pulse pounding. The smell hit me again, even stronger now. But when I led them to the storage room, I stopped cold. The body was gone. The room was empty. No blood. No sign that anyone had ever been there. I turned to Daniels, my mouth dry. I swear, he was right here. Daniels frowned, then turned to Mercer. Check outside. Mercer nodded and stepped out. I stood there, staring at the empty floor, trying to make sense of it. The smell was still there, lingering in the air, but the body was gone. Daniels sighed. Sir, are you sure about what you saw? I didn't answer, because I didn't know anymore. Mercer came back a few minutes later. Nothing outside. No tracks, no blood, no signs of anything. Daniels gave me a long look. You been drinking? Clenched my jaw. No, he sighed again, rubbing his temple. Well, look, if you see anything else, let us know. And just like that, they left. I stood there in my cabin, alone, staring at the empty room where a dead man had been just hours before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, rifle in my lap, listening, waiting. By morning, the smell was gone. I checked the whole cabin, every inch of it. No signs of forced entry, no blood, nothing. I didn't know what scared me more. The fact that someone had been in my cabin and left a body, or the fact that they'd come back to take it before the cops arrived. I didn't stay long after that. A week later, I packed up what little I owned, locked the place up, and left. I never went back. I was a furniture mechanic, fixing and restoring old wooden pieces. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I liked working with my hands, and I was good at it. Most of my work was done in town, but every now and then, I got called out to remote places. People with money who had antique furniture they didn't trust anyone else to fix. That's how I ended up at a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The man who hired me, a guy named Richard, had bought the place recently. He told me he wanted to fix it up and turn it into a hunting retreat. He had old wooden furniture in there, some of it original to the cabin, and he wanted it restored instead of replaced. He paid me in advance, which was rare, and told me I could stay in the cabin while I worked since it was too far to drive back and forth every day. The place was deep in the woods, off an old logging road that barely showed up on maps. It was fall and the leaves had turned, making the drive in almost pleasant. The cabin itself was bigger than I expected. 2 floors, a porch that wrapped around the front, and thick log walls that had been there for decades. The air smelled like damp wood and fallen leaves. The trees around the cabin were dense, blocking most of the sky. It felt isolated. Inside, the furniture was old but solid. Massive wooden chairs, a dining table that could seat 10, a wardrobe, a heavy desk in one of the upstairs rooms. Most of it was covered in dust. Some pieces had scratches, others had rotting legs that needed replacing. I had brought my tools and supplies, figuring it would take me a week, maybe more, to get everything done. I started with the dining table. The wood was dry and cracked, and one of the legs was loose. I set up my tools in the main room, laid out everything I needed, and got to work. The only sounds were my tools and the occasional rustle of trees outside. No traffic, no voices, just the quiet of the woods. That first night, I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The cabin had no electricity, just an old wood stove for heat and a few oil lamps for light. I kept one burning next to the bed, not comfortable with the complete darkness. The wind picked up overnight, and I heard branches creaking and shifting outside. At one point, I thought I heard something moving near the porch, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. The next day, I moved on to the chairs. They were hand-carved, thick and sturdy, but one of them had a missing piece in the backrest. I set it aside to work on later. I had sanded down two of the others when I heard something outside, heavy footsteps on the porch. I turned quickly, expecting to see Richard or maybe some hunter passing through, but the porch was empty. The woods beyond the clearing were still. I walked to the door, stepped outside, and looked around. Nothing, just the trees and the wind. I shook it off and went back inside. That night, I woke up to the sound of something shifting downstairs, a soft scraping noise like wood against wood. I sat up, listening. The cabin settled and creaked, but this was different. It was deliberate. I got out of bed and grabbed the oil lamp. I moved slowly down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The main room looked the same as before. My tools on the floor, the furniture where I had left it. But one of the chairs I had been working on was turned slightly, facing away from the table. I stared at it, trying to remember if I had left it like that. I must have. I was just tired, that was all. I put the chair back, made sure the doors were locked, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the floor near the chair. Not normal scratches from moving furniture, these were long, almost deliberate. I ran my fingers over them, feeling how rough they were. They hadn't been there before. I checked the doors again, still locked. That day, I worked upstairs on the wardrobe. The wood was warped, making the doors stick. I took them off the hinges, sanded the edges, and planned to reattach them the next morning. When I went downstairs for a break, I noticed something strange. The dining table had shifted slightly. It wasn't where I left it. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to convince myself I had just nudged it earlier without realizing it. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up. Every shift of the wind made me listen harder. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Not the house settling, something heavier. I gripped the lamp and went downstairs. The furniture was different, not just moved, rearranged. The chairs were no longer around the table. Two were near the door, one was against the wall. The table itself had shifted at least a foot. My tools had been scattered. My toolbox was open. Some of my chisels and sandpaper spilled onto the floor. I checked the door. Still locked. Something was in the cabin. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening. The wind howled outside, and once, just before dawn, I swore I heard a low, slow creaking, like wood bending under weight. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my tools, left some of the bigger pieces unfinished, and loaded up my truck. Before I left, I went back inside one last time. The main room was still in disarray. The scratches on the floor looked deeper. One of the chairs had been pushed so far back it was almost against the staircase. I walked to the chair, gripping the backrest. It was solid, heavier than I remembered. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Carved into the back of the chair, faint and worn with age, were words. Just a few, barely visible unless you looked closely. Leave it. I didn't touch anything else. I walked out, locked the door behind me, and drove away without looking back. Richard called me a few days later, asking why I left early. I told him I had finished most of the work and that the rest was minor. I didn't tell him about the scratches. I didn't tell him about the furniture moving. I didn't tell him about the words on the chair. I never went back to that cabin. Whatever was there, whatever was shifting things in the night, it didn't want me fixing anything. and I wasn't about to argue with it. It was late October when I found myself driving through the back roads of Tennessee, the kind of roads that never seemed to be used by anyone but the people who lived along them. The trees lining the narrow path had already begun shedding their leaves, turning the ground into a thick carpet of gold and brown. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decaying foliage, and the sky had settled into that dull gray shade that seemed to suck the light out of everything. I hadn't meant to come this way. I told myself that over and over as the road twisted through the hills, the woods creeping closer on both sides. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and instead of cutting across state lines on the highway, I was stuck in the winding paths of my past. My gas gauge was low, and my phone had no signal. I should have turned around the moment I saw the familiar stretch of road. But I didn't. The further I went, the deeper the feeling settled in my chest. I knew what was coming, knew that just a few miles ahead, tucked between the trees, was a place I hadn't seen in years. A place I swore I'd never go near again. My ex-wife's cabin. It wasn't hers anymore. She had sold it after the divorce, and from what I heard, it sat empty for years before someone else bought the land. That was a long time ago. Whoever owned it now likely didn't even know who we were, didn't know the weight that place held. Still, my fingers clenched tighter around the steering wheel as I rounded the bend. The trees thinned out just enough for the outline of the cabin to come into view. It looked the same. A long gravel driveway led up to the front porch, weeds creeping through the cracks. The dark wood siding was aged and weathered, but the place still stood, the same as it had the last time I saw it. I slowed down, not stopping, but just enough to take it in. And that's when I saw it. A single light in the window. There shouldn't have been a light. The place was supposed to be abandoned. No cars in the driveway, no signs of movement. But there it was, a faint yellow glow behind the curtain of what used to be our bedroom. I kept driving. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone had moved in recently and just didn't have a car. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to let myself look back in the rearview mirror. The feeling didn't go away. The road stretched on for another mile before I spotted a rundown gas station up ahead, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. A single pump stood beside the small building, and the neon open sign flickered weakly in the window. I pulled in, parking beside the pump, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Inside, the store was empty except for an older man behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the place smelled like stale coffee and motor oil. I grabbed a bottle of water and walked up to the counter. As the cashier rang me up, I hesitated, then asked, "Hey, do you know if anyone lives in that old cabin up the road?" He barely looked up. "Which one?" "The one about a mile back. Used to belong to..." I stopped myself. Used to be empty for a long time. The man finally glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Ain't nobody lived there in years." I frowned, but I just passed it. Saw a light on inside. He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Couldn't tell you. Place has been sitting quiet for a while now. If there's a light on, maybe someone's squatting in there." That was the most logical explanation. I nodded, paid for the water, and headed back to my truck. But the thought stuck with me. I shouldn't have gone back. I should have just driven off, taken the highway, and forgotten about it. But as I sat there in the parking lot, the sky darkening around me, something in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. Who would squat in that cabin? It was miles away from anything. There were easier places to hide if someone wanted to get off the grid. And why was the light on in that particular room? I turned the key in the ignition, and then, against every bit of common sense I had, I turned the truck around and headed back. The road was even darker now, the trees pressing in from both sides. My headlights cast long shadows across the dirt and gravel, and the night air seemed thicker than before. When I reached the driveway, I hesitated. The light was still on. I pulled off onto the side of the road, cutting my engine. Sitting there in the dark, I could hear nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. The cabin remained still, no movement behind the windows, no sign of life beyond that single, glowing light. I stepped out of the truck. The air was colder than before. I walked slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel as I approached the porch. The front door was closed, the wood warped and cracked with age. I reached out and tried the handle. Locked. I circled the cabin, my pulse steady but heavy. The windows were filthy, streaked with years of dirt and neglect. I reached the back, where the bedroom window sat just a few feet off the ground. The light was still on, and then I saw something that made my breath catch. The curtain moved, just slightly, just enough for me to see a hand pressing against the glass. Fingers splayed out, motionless. I stepped back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in my truck and leave. But I stood frozen, staring up at that hand, at the pale skin against the dark glass. And then it pulled away. The light went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my boots slamming against the ground as I bolted back to my truck. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel flew as I spun the wheel, my headlights slicing through the night. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The light was back on, and the curtain was pulled aside. A face stared back at me. I never went back. I don't know who or what I saw that night. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe it was something else. But I know one thing. I never should have stopped. I never wanted the cabin. It was left to me after my uncle passed, a man I barely knew. He had no children of his own, and for reasons I never understood, he left it in my name. The lawyer who handled his will sent me a letter explaining the details, and a week later, I had the deed in my hands. The cabin was in a small, forgotten town, tucked in a valley far from the main road. The only thing nearby was a graveyard, an old one, the kind with faded tombstones, sunken into the earth, the names barely readable. I had no reason to keep the cabin. I lived in the city, had a steady job, and wasn't interested in some rundown place in the middle of nowhere. I figured I'd go there, check it out, and put it up for sale. Quick trip, maybe a weekend at most. I drove out on a Friday morning. The road stretched long and empty, the trees leaning in like they were trying to swallow the pavement. It rained most of the way, a slow, steady drizzle that made everything gray. By the time I reached the turnoff, the dirt road leading to the cabin was muddy and uneven, my tires slipping as I drove through deep puddles. The first thing I saw was the graveyard. It was about 100 yards from the cabin, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. Some of the metal bars had fallen, the gate barely hanging on by one hinge. The place looked forgotten, like no one had visited in years. The cabin was just as bad. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging a little in the middle. The windows were dirty, streaked with years of grime. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The key barely fit in the lock, and when I turned it, the door groaned open, the hinges stiff with rust. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered everything, tables, chairs, even the floor. The furniture was old, the kind of heavy wooden pieces no one made anymore. A single bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with books so aged their spines had curled. There were no pictures, no personal belongings. It felt more like an abandoned hunting lodge than a home. I spent the first hour just walking around, getting a feel for the place. The cabin had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. The bathroom was the only part that had been updated at some point, the sink and toilet newer than everything else. There was a back door leading out to a small clearing, and beyond that, the thick tree line. The forest pressed in from all sides, dense and dark even in the daylight. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just silence. I told myself it was fine. I'd clean up, take a few pictures, and find a buyer. Maybe some retired couple looking for a quiet place, or some hunter wanting a lodge near the woods. By evening, I had swept most of the dust away and cleaned the kitchen enough to make a simple meal. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the crackling wood, trying to ignore the feeling that the place didn't want me there. Then I heard it, a soft thump outside. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy for that. It sounded like a footstep. I turned off the lantern and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The graveyard was just visible in the moonlight, the tombstones casting long shadows. The fence stood silent, unmoving, but something felt off. I waited, holding my breath. After a few minutes, there was nothing, just my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself it was nothing. The woods played tricks on people. Sounds carried in strange ways out here. I went to bed, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I walked to the graveyard. I didn't know why. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it was just a normal, empty place. The ground was uneven, covered in weeds. Some of the graves had caved in slightly. The wood of the coffins beneath likely rotted away long ago. I walked between the stones, reading names that meant nothing to me. Most of them were from the 1800s, a few from the early 1900s. There was no sign of anyone else having been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I went back to the cabin, forcing myself to focus on packing up. I found some old letters in a drawer, written in handwriting so faded I could barely read it. Most of it didn't make sense, but one line stood out. Asterisk, the ground will not keep them. Asterisk, that night, I heard the footsteps again. They were closer. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight in my hand, listening. Something moved outside. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the cabin. Then came the sound of something scraping against the wooden walls. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but I knew better. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was done. I packed my bags, threw everything into the truck, and was ready to leave. But the truck wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. The battery was fine. I checked twice. I sat there, gripping the wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. I had enough supplies to last the night. In the morning, I'd walk to the main road and flag someone down. As the sun set, I locked every door and window, pushing a chair against the front door. The sounds started early this time. First, the footsteps, slow, careful. Then the scratching. Then the breathing, right outside the window. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin, over and over. Then they stopped. For hours, nothing. Then, a soft creak from inside the cabin. I gripped the flashlight. My hands were shaking. Something was inside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then another creak. Closer this time. I turned the flashlight on. The room was empty. I grabbed my knife, my hands slick with sweat. I stood in the middle of the cabin, my back to the wall, waiting. Another creak. Right behind me. I spun, but there was nothing. The door was still locked. The windows shut. But something had been there. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bags and left on foot, walking until I reached the main road. I never went back. A month later, I sold the cabin for almost nothing. I didn't care. I didn't want it. I never spoke about what happened, never tried to explain. because I didn't understand it myself. But I know one thing, the ground there does not keep the dead. The rain had started falling in the late afternoon, thick and heavy, the kind that didn't come in drops but in solid sheets that swallowed everything in sight. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the Amazon was drenched in darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, green scent of crushed vegetation. My cabin sat in a small clearing, barely visible through the dense jungle. The roof was metal, dented from years of weathering storms, and the wooden walls had darkened with moisture over time. I had come out here alone, looking for solitude, away from the noise of the city. A friend had mentioned an old research station abandoned deep in the jungle, left behind by a group of biologists years ago. It wasn't much. A single-room structure with a cot, a table, and a few shelves lined with rusting cans of food. The windows had no glass, only wooden shutters, and the door barely held in place with a rusty latch. I had brought supplies, expecting to stay for a couple of weeks, testing my endurance against the jungle, seeing how well I could live with just the basics. The storm grew worse as the night deepened. The sound of rain against the metal roof was deafening, a constant hammering that made it impossible to hear anything beyond the walls of the cabin. The jungle was alive with movement, the sound of leaves shifting, branches cracking under the weight of unseen things. I sat at the small wooden table, the glow of my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I had eaten earlier, canned beans and some stale crackers, washed down with warm water from my supply. The humidity made everything feel sticky, my shirt clinging to my back, my skin damp no matter how many times I wiped it dry. I had left my boots by the door, caked in mud from the hike earlier. The inside of the cabin smelled of damp wood, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of the machete resting on the table beside me. Then something shifted outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it moved through the trees, making the leaves rustle in a rhythmic pattern. But this was different, a deliberate sound, slow footsteps in the mud, just outside the cabin. The rain should have drowned out everything, but I heard it clear as day, squelch, pause, squelch. Someone or something was moving just beyond the walls. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. My eyes adjusted, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of lightning through the gaps in the wooden shutters. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear past the rain. The footsteps stopped. Silence except for the relentless downpour. I waited, seconds stretching into minutes. My hand gripped the handle of my machete, my knuckles white. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a tapir wandering too close, or a jaguar moving through the underbrush. But something didn't feel right. The footsteps had been too precise, too human. Then came the knock. Not loud, not demanding. Just a single, deliberate knock on the wooden door. I stayed frozen. The rain pounded against the roof, water dripped from the corners of the cabin, and my own heartbeat thundered in my ears. Another knock. Soft, slow. I didn't move. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. The cabin was small, isolated. There was no way to hide, no way to slip out unseen. I waited, gripping the machete, willing myself to breathe quietly. Minutes passed. No more knocks, no more footsteps, just the storm relentless as ever. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the chair, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. Morning came slowly, the rain finally easing into a misty drizzle. I forced myself to move, my muscles stiff from staying in the same position for hours. I unlatched the door cautiously, pushing it open just enough to see outside. Mud. The ground was thick with it, pooling in places where the rain had carved deep grooves. And there, just a few feet from the door, were footprints. Not animal tracks, bare human feet, deep impressions in the wet earth. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line, my machete still clutched in my hand. Nothing. No sign of who or what had been there during the night. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the jungle. I followed them for a few steps, but they were washed out by the rain, blending into the endless brown of the forest floor. I went back inside, shutting the door behind me, securing the latch as best as I could. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching, waiting. I packed my things. The plan had been to stay for 2 weeks, but I had no reason to test my luck. By noon, I was hiking back through the jungle, my gear strapped to my back, my machete never leaving my hand. The path was muddy, the air thick with moisture, but I moved fast, my pulse quick with the knowledge that I wasn't safe. I didn't look back. I had never planned to be alone in that cabin. It was meant to be a quiet trip, one where I could get away from the noise of daily life, clear my head, and just exist in peace. My friend Mark had been the one to suggest it. He had stayed there once before, a few years back, and told me it was the perfect place to just relax. I didn't ask many questions at the time. I trusted his word, and when he said it was remote but comfortable, I figured it was exactly what I needed. The cabin was deep in the English countryside, somewhere in the Midlands, surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, maybe a half-hour drive, but it was isolated enough that I wouldn't see another soul for the duration of my stay. That was the appeal. I had spent too much time caught up in the rush of the city, and I wanted to get away from it all. It was early October when I arrived, and the air had already started to turn crisp. The drive out had been uneventful, though the last stretch of road leading to the cabin had been rough. The path was narrow, little more than a dirt track that wound through the trees, and by the time I pulled up outside the cabin, my car was coated in a fine layer of dust. The cabin itself was modest but well kept. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a stone chimney. There was a shed off to the side, which Mark had told me was used for firewood, and behind the cabin, the trees stretched endlessly into the distance. It was peaceful. I spent the first few hours settling in. The inside was simple, just a living area, a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a small bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the bare essentials. That was fine. I had brought books, and I planned to spend most of my time just reading and hiking. By the time the sun started setting, I was outside chopping some wood for the fireplace. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the air as I worked. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the rhythm of splitting logs and stacking them beside the porch, when I noticed something strange. The woods had gone completely silent. At first, I didn't register it as anything unusual, but as I stood there, axe in hand, I realized that the usual background noise, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, had vanished. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I turned slowly, scanning the treeline. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. I gave one last glance before picking up the chopped logs and heading inside. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It had been a long day and I was tired. That was all. Inside, I got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled into one of the old armchairs with a book. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, that I wasn't used to the isolation, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard something outside. A soft crunch of leaves. It was faint, barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire, but it was there. I set my book down and listened. Another crunch. Footsteps. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The porch light barely reached past the clearing, but I could just make out the edge of the woods. Then I saw her, a woman, standing just beyond the tree line. She wasn't moving, just standing there staring. Even from a distance, something about her was wrong. Her clothes looked tattered, like they had been worn for far too long. Her hair was a tangled mess, hanging in long, uneven strands around her face. But it was the way she stood that made my skin crawl. Completely still, arms limp at her sides, head tilted slightly as if she was trying to listen to something. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For what felt like minutes, we just stood there, me inside, her outside, both frozen in place. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back into the trees. I watched until she disappeared. I tried to tell myself that she was just some lost hiker. Maybe she lived nearby and had wandered too far. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. There was something deliberate about the way she had been standing there. Something unsettling about how she had just watched me without saying a word. I locked the door. The rest of the night was restless. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back home, but a part of me felt ridiculous. It was just one weird moment. I couldn't let my mind get carried away. The day passed without incident. I went for a hike, made lunch, tried to enjoy the peace and quiet. But as evening approached, the feeling of unease returned. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see her again. And then, as the last light of the sun faded, I did. She was standing closer this time, not at the tree line, but near the shed. And this time, she was facing away from me. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, like she was listening for something. I didn't move. I just watched. Then, without warning, she took a step toward the cabin, and then another. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fire poker, and backed up. She kept coming. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I didn't wait any longer. I moved toward the back door, threw it open, and ran. I didn't stop. Not when I reached my car, not when I fumbled with the keys, not even when I got the engine started and tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached town. I ended up booking a hotel for the night, too shaken to drive all the way home. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, unmoving, listening. The next morning, I called Mark, told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Yeah, I saw her too. I never went back." I never liked hunting alone. I knew men who did it, who took some kind of pride in isolating themselves in the wild, cutting off all human contact for a few days to be alone with their thoughts and the sound of the woods. I wasn't one of those men. I liked the company, the security of knowing someone else was keeping watch, that I wasn't the only pair of eyes scanning the trees or ears listening for something unnatural in the underbrush. But that year, circumstances forced my hand. I had taken a week off from work and planned a trip with my cousin, Eric, but he backed out at the last minute because his wife was expecting earlier than planned. My usual backup, my longtime hunting buddy Mark, had work commitments he couldn't get out of. I almost canceled the trip entirely, but I had already set everything up, requested time off, packed my gear, checked the maps, even prepped the cabin I'd be using. I figured I could handle it for just a few nights. I'd been hunting these woods since I was in my 20s, and they never gave me trouble. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 5-hour drive from my house, and nearly an hour from the nearest paved road. It was an old, single-room hunting cabin built in the 50s, sturdy enough to last but basic. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. It sat at the edge of a clearing, with thick trees surrounding it on three sides and a slope leading down to a creek in the back. The first day went as planned. I arrived in the afternoon, settled in, and spent the rest of the evening scouting a few spots where I'd seen deer on past trips. The air was crisp, the sky overcast. I set up a tree stand a few hundred yards from the cabin and checked for tracks. The woods were quiet, which I didn't think much of at the time. The second day, I headed out early, rifle slung over my shoulder. I sat in the stand for hours, barely moving. The forest was still, too still. No birds, no distant rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I saw nothing, not even a squirrel. It was odd, but not unheard of. Sometimes the woods went quiet, and the animals moved somewhere else for a while. At noon, I climbed down and walked further into the woods, looking for fresh signs of movement. That's when I found the first carcass. It was a deer, what was left of it. The body had been torn apart, not eaten, just shredded. Its head was intact, tilted at an odd angle, but its torso was a mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. The legs had been pulled away from the body, not chewed off, but ripped clean from the sockets. It wasn't a kill from a hunter, and it wasn't the work of wolves or a bear. There were no bite marks, no sign of anything feeding, just destruction. I crouched near the remains, scanning the ground. There were no tracks. The leaves and dirt around the carcass were undisturbed. It was as if the deer had been killed and dropped there from above. The air smelled of iron and decay, sharp enough to make me step back. Something wasn't right. I left the carcass and walked back to the cabin, rifle in hand, ears straining for any sound. The woods stayed silent. I told myself it was a freak occurrence, a wounded deer that got attacked by something desperate or a poacher who killed for sport and left the body behind. But the unease stayed with me. That night, I sat inside the cabin with the door locked, listening to the woods. The wind picked up, and rain started falling, tapping against the metal roof. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something outside, a soft, steady sound, footsteps in the wet leaves. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear past the rain. Nothing, just the wind pushing against the trees. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal moving through the brush, and I lay back down, gripping the rifle tightly. But I didn't sleep. The third day, I found another carcass. This one was closer to the cabin. Another deer torn apart in the same way. And this time there was something else. A set of deep scratches in the tree beside the body, long and deliberate. Not claw marks from a bear, something else. I was done. I packed my things and decided to leave before the sun went down. I'd never abandoned a hunting trip before, but something about those woods felt wrong. I locked up the cabin, loaded my gear into the truck, and started down the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. It was slow going. The rain had turned the road into mud, and I had to keep my speed low to avoid sliding into the trees. About 10 minutes into the drive, I saw movement in the trees to my left, something large, keeping pace with my truck. I didn't get a good look at it, just a dark shape moving fast, too fast for anything on two legs, but the wrong size for anything on four. It was just a glimpse, a shadow against the trees, but it was enough. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck fishtailing in the mud. The shadow stayed with me for another few seconds, then veered off into the woods. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I never went back to that cabin. I still hunt, but only with others. I don't talk about what I saw. I don't have an explanation for it, but I know that something was out there in those woods with me. And whatever it wasn't hunting to eat. It was hunting to kill. I had always been the kind of person who liked to be alone. Solitude never bothered me. If anything, I preferred it. That's why I took up a job working as a fire lookout deep in the high desert of Nevada. The job was simple: keep an eye out for wildfires, log any signs of smoke, and report unusual activity. I spent weeks at a time in a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but dry, twisted trees, rocky hills, and an endless sky. The isolation didn't scare me. I enjoyed the quiet, but after what happened that summer, I don't think I could ever go back. It started in early June. The fire season had just begun, and I was stationed at one of the older cabins, built decades ago by the Forest Service. It was nothing fancy, just a one-room structure with a cot, a wood stove, and a radio for communication. I had a generator that powered a single light bulb and a small fridge. Water came from a well out back, and I had a rifle for emergencies. The nearest ranger station was about 40 miles away, and the closest town was even further. The only way in or out was by an old dirt road that twisted through the hills. Once you were up there, you were truly on your own. The first few days passed quietly. I did my rounds, checking for smoke and making notes in my logbook. At night, I sat on the porch, staring at the endless stars above, listening to the wind howl through the dry brush. The desert could be strangely beautiful at night, the way the landscape stretched out for miles, silent and untouched. Then, on the fourth night, I noticed something strange. I was sitting outside as usual, enjoying the cool air, when I heard something moving in the brush. It wasn't the wind, this was different. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I turned off my lantern and listened. Crunch, a single step, then nothing. I gripped my rifle and scanned the tree line. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outlines of the twisted pinyon pines, their branches casting long shadows across the ground. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or a coyote. I went inside and locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. By morning, I had convinced myself I had imagined it. I went about my usual routine, checking my maps, scanning the horizon for smoke, making sure the generator had fuel. The day passed uneventfully, and by nightfall, I had nearly forgotten about the noise, until I saw the figure. It was just after sunset. I was standing on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee, when I spotted movement near the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else. A man. He was standing about 50 yards away, half hidden behind a tree. His body was rigid, unmoving. I couldn't make out his face, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. He was too still, too silent. I called out, but he didn't respond. He didn't move at all. A cold wave of fear washed over me. What the hell was he doing all the way out here? There were no trails, no campsites, no reason for anyone to be wandering around this deep in the wilderness. I stepped inside and locked the door, keeping my rifle close. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, listening. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Crunch. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I gripped the rifle and held my breath. Then scraping. A soft, dragging sound against the wooden walls of the cabin. It stopped near the window. I couldn't see outside, but I could feel it. Someone or something was right there. Then a low whisper. Not words, just a sound. A breath, almost like a sigh. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the hills, the presence faded. The footsteps retreated, vanishing into the desert. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I searched the area, looking for tracks. I found them near the tree line, deep human-like prints in the dry dirt. but they weren't quite right. The spacing was off, the shape too long, the toes too pointed. I followed them for about 100 yards before they disappeared. No sign of where they led. No sign of where they came from. That night, I barricaded the door. I tried to radio the ranger station, but the static was too heavy. The following night was worse. The figure returned. This time, it came closer. I heard it circling the cabin, its footsteps unnaturally slow, like it was deliberately making me aware of its presence. Then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. My own voice, outside. In the darkness, I heard it calling my name. It was wrong. The tone was off, the cadence unnatural. It was like someone had recorded my voice and was playing it back through an old speaker, slightly distorted, stretched in a way that made it sound inhuman. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, gripping my rifle, waiting for dawn. By the time the sun rose, the voice was gone. I left that morning. I packed up whatever I could carry and drove the long, winding road back to town without looking back. I didn't even tell my supervisor why I left. I just quit. I never went back to that cabin. A few years later, I met a ranger who had taken over my old post. I asked him how it was out there, trying to sound casual. He gave me a strange look and told me he had quit too. Said he heard things at night. Said he saw something standing near the trees. Said he heard his own voice whispering to him in the dark. I never spoke about it again. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wanted me to come outside. I had been working as a police officer for nearly 8 years when I was assigned to a remote station in a rural part of Montana. The town itself was small, barely a few hundred people, but the land stretched for miles, mostly dense forests and open fields. It was the kind of place where you could drive for hours and not see a single house. People here kept to themselves, and crime was rare, mostly petty theft or disputes between neighbors. The station wasn't much of a station at all. It was a single-room cabin sitting at the edge of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by nothing but trees. It had been built decades ago, back when the area had more logging activity. The county never saw the need to upgrade it. Inside, it was basic: one desk, a radio, a couple of filing cabinets, and a cot in the corner for overnight shifts. There was no proper holding cell, just a locked storage closet that we occasionally used to detain drunks until they sobered up. Most nights were quiet. The job was mostly sitting at the desk, listening to the radio, and sometimes driving out to check on abandoned properties that people called in about. The locals were paranoid about trespassers, though we rarely found anything when we investigated. That night, I was scheduled for the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning. My partner, Officer Reeves, had taken the earlier shift, and when I arrived, he looked relieved to see me. He handed over the keys and gave me a tired nod before heading out. "Nothing to report," he said. "That was normal." I nodded back, watching as he pulled his jacket tight against the cold and walked out to his truck. The gravel crunched under his boots, and then he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. I locked the door behind him and sat at the desk. The cabin was dimly lit, the single bulb overhead buzzing faintly. I switched on the radio, listening to static for a moment before tuning it to the sheriff's frequency. A few voices crackled through, mostly deputies from a neighboring town checking in. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. 8 hours to go. The first couple of hours passed in silence. I made rounds inside the cabin, checked the perimeter, and wrote up a few reports for minor incidents that had happened earlier in the week. Just before 3 a.m., I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The cold air bit at my face, and I could see my breath in the light from the porch lamp. The forest was silent, the trees barely swaying in the stillness. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but standing there on the porch, I felt watched. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. I shook it off and went back inside. It was easy to get paranoid out here. Hours of isolation played tricks on your mind. I sat back at the desk and checked the radio again. Still nothing. Then, at 3:27 a.m., a call came through. County dispatch to Station 4. Do you copy? I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. Station 4. Go ahead. Got a report of a vehicle abandoned off Route 17 near the old sawmill. Caller said it's been sitting there for hours. No sign of the driver. Can you check it out? I hesitated. Route 17 was nearly a 30-minute drive through back roads. Normally, I'd wait until morning to check something like that, but we didn't get many calls this late. Copy that, I said. Heading out now. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. My cruiser was parked next to the cabin, covered in a thin layer of frost. I climbed in, started the engine, and turned on the heat. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. Nothing, just my imagination. The drive was slow. The road was rough, mostly gravel, and the deeper I went, the thicker the trees became. There were no streetlights out here, only the high beams cutting through the dark. When I reached the sawmill, I spotted the vehicle immediately. A dark sedan, its hazard lights faintly blinking. It was parked just off the road, partially hidden by the trees. I pulled up behind it, radioed in my location, and stepped out. The air was still. No wind, no sound. Just that pressing silence that made my skin crawl. I approached the car carefully, one hand resting on my holster. The driver's side door was open. The interior light was on, casting a dim glow on the ground. I peered inside. Empty. No keys in the ignition, no signs of struggle. A jacket lay on the passenger seat, and a half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the ground. Footprints, leading into the woods. My gut told me to wait for backup, but I knew the nearest deputy was at least 45 minutes away. If someone was lost or hurt, they wouldn't last that long in the cold. I followed the tracks. The trees swallowed the light from my flashlight as I moved deeper. The footprints were uneven, like whoever made them was stumbling. About 50 yards in, I found something. A shoe. A single, black sneaker, half buried in the frost-covered leaves. I bent down to examine it. It was damp, the laces untied. Then I heard it. A rustling sound. Close. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the trees. Nothing. Then footsteps. Fast, heavy, coming from behind me. I spun around just as something crashed through the underbrush. My hand went to my gun, but before I could react, a figure barreled past me, almost knocking me over. A man, pale, wide-eyed, wearing a torn jacket. He didn't stop. He didn't even look at me. He just ran, disappearing into the darkness. I shouted after him, but he didn't respond. I ran back to my cruiser and called it in. The dispatcher told me to hold my position until backup arrived. 15 minutes later, 2 deputies showed up. We searched the woods, but the man was gone. We towed the car back to the station. The next morning, we ran the plates. The car belonged to a man reported missing 2 days earlier. He had last been seen in a town over 100 miles away. We never found him. His wallet was in the car. His phone had no recent calls. No explanation. I transferred out of that station a month later. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man. Running through the woods. Not towards something, but away from it. And whatever it was still out there. It was late October when I took the trip out to my uncle's old hunting cabin. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and uneven terrain. It had been in my family for years, though no one had used it much after my uncle passed away a decade ago. It was old, isolated, and falling apart in some places, but it was still standing. I had no real reason to go out there other than wanting some time away. Life had been dragging me down, and I needed space to think. The idea of staying out in the woods for a few days seemed like the kind of escape I needed. I packed my truck with supplies, food, water, a rifle, and plenty of warm clothes. The forecast showed cold weather with chances of rain, but I didn't mind. The drive took me longer than expected. The roads leading up to the cabin were rough, barely maintained, and covered in fallen leaves that hid deep potholes. My tires crunched over the gravel as I navigated the winding path, the trees closing in around me the farther I went. It was early afternoon when I finally arrived. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. A small, single-story wooden structure with a covered porch and a tin roof. The windows were dusty, the door slightly warped from years of weather. It was nothing special, just a place meant for hunting trips and weekend getaways. But it felt safe, or at least it used to. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of aged wood and dust. A single table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, a small kitchen to the left, and a fireplace against the far wall. A door led to the bedroom, where an old cot sat against the wall. It wasn't much, but it would do. I spent the next hour cleaning up, wiping dust off surfaces, checking the fireplace, and making sure the place was still sturdy enough to stay in. Once I was settled, I took a short walk around the property, the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots breaking the silence. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. As evening settled in, I started a fire in the fireplace and heated up a can of chili. The warmth filled the room, and I sat at the table, staring at the flames, lost in thought. It felt good to be away from everything, away from people, away from the noise of life. I went to bed early, exhaustion from the day settling in fast. The cot was uncomfortable, the blankets thin, but I was too tired to care. The sound of the wind outside was steady, and after a while, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if it was just the wind. I lay still, listening, my breath slow. Then I heard it again, a soft thud, like something moving outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the rifle beside my bed. The cabin was pitch black, the fire having burned low. I listened, my grip tightening on the gun. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, not the sound of an animal, but something heavier. Someone walking. I swallowed hard and stood up, moving carefully toward the window. The glass was dirty, but I could see just enough outside. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, and for a moment, I saw nothing. But then movement near the trees. A figure, standing still, facing the cabin. My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It just stood there, watching. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. My hands tightened around the rifle, my body frozen in place. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that maybe it was just a trick of the light. But then the figure took a slow step forward. I backed away from the window. The air in the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. I had locked the door when I arrived. I was sure of it, but doubt crept in. I moved toward it, checking the handle. It was still locked. The footsteps outside grew louder. Whoever it was, they were coming closer. I raised the rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then silence. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my muscles tense. Minutes passed. Nothing. Had they left? I stood there for what felt like hours, my ears straining to pick up any sound. Finally, After what seemed like forever, I moved back to the cot, guns still in hand. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slowly. The first thing I did was check outside. There were footprints in the dirt, deep, fresh, leading up to the cabin and stopping just outside the window. Whoever it was had been standing there for a long time. I scanned the woods, looking for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I considered packing up and leaving, but something in me refused. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to let fear chase me away. Either way, I stayed. I spent the day gathering firewood, keeping an eye on the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place. The sun hung low in the sky by the time I returned to the cabin. I locked the door, checked the rifle, and waited. It happened again. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps outside. I sat up, my grip on the rifle tight. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. They stopped near the front door. Then the handle moved. A slow, careful turn. Locked. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a knock. A single, soft knock. I didn't move. Another knock. Then nothing. The silence stretched on, but I knew whoever was out there was still standing on the other side. I stayed awake all night. Morning brought a terrible sight. More footprints. More signs of someone watching. But this time I found something worse. A knife, stabbed into the wooden railing of the porch. A warning. I didn't hesitate anymore. I packed up my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. The whole drive back, I checked the mirror, expecting to see something following me. But I never did. I never found out who it was. Never went back to the cabin. Some places are better left abandoned. And some people wait in the dark, watching. Started as a job. Just another contract, another project in the middle of nowhere. The kind of work that paid well because most people didn't want to do it. We were hired to build a cabin deep in the woods for a client who wanted something off-grid. No power lines, no roads, nothing but trees, dirt, and whatever we brought with us. The job was supposed to take 6 weeks. The company provided everything we needed: tools, materials, supplies, and even a small prefab cabin for us to stay in while we worked. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough. Just 4 of us out there, working from dawn to dusk, cutting wood, laying the foundation, piecing together something that would eventually stand strong against the elements. The first week was fine. Hard work, long days, but nothing unexpected. The only real problem was the isolation. There was no cell service, no contact with the outside world unless we drove an hour back to the nearest town. But we were used to that. We'd built cabins before, sometimes in places even more remote than this. It was around the second week that things started feeling off. We found footprints, not ours. At first, I thought maybe the client had come to check on us. Some people like to see the progress for themselves, even if they had to hike miles through rough terrain to do it. But when I looked closer, I knew something wasn't right. The footprints were deep, uneven, like whoever left them was dragging their feet. And there were a lot of them circling our worksite, weaving between the trees, overlapping in a way that made no sense. That night, none of us talked about it. Maybe we were all thinking the same thing. Animals, erosion, maybe even just our own tracks getting messed up by the wind and rain. But the next day, we saw them again. More of them, fresh ones. That's when I started feeling it. It's hard to explain that kind of feeling to someone who's never been out there, in a place where there's nothing but trees and silence. It's not fear, not at first. It's something quieter, a kind of awareness that creeps into your bones. The sense that you're not alone, even when you should be. We worked harder after that. Faster. The sooner we finished, the sooner we could leave. By the third week, things got worse. It wasn't just the footprints anymore. Tools started disappearing. At first, it was small things, screws, nails, a wrench here and there. Things that could be misplaced, lost in the dirt or under piles of lumber. But then it was bigger things. A saw, a hammer, an entire stack of boards we were sure we had cut the day before. It didn't make sense. We searched the whole site, even checked the storage shed we had set up near the prefab cabin. Nothing. Then one night we heard something. It was late, well past the time any of us should have been awake. The rain had come in hard that evening, drumming against the roof, turning the dirt outside into thick mud. I had been trying to sleep when I heard it. Movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just beyond the walls of our cabin. I held my breath, listening. The others must have heard it too because the whole room felt tense, the air thick with something I didn't have a name for. The footsteps stopped. Then a sound against the wall. A soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the wood. None of us moved. It lasted for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably just a minute or two. Then silence. The next morning, we found more footprints, deep ones, leading from the trees to our cabin, circling around it before disappearing back into the woods. The mud had caught them perfectly, large, misshapen, some looking like bare feet, others like something else entirely. We kept working. We didn't have a choice. By the fourth week, we had started keeping a fire going at night. It didn't do much to ease the feeling, but it gave us something to focus on. A barrier, even if it was just in our heads. One night, I was the last one awake, sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the woods. That's when I saw it. Movement, just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see clearly, not in the darkness, but there was something there. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the light of the fire, watching. I didn't move. It didn't either. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in some silent standoff, but eventually, I blinked and it was gone. The next morning, I told myself I imagined it, that it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But I knew better. We were being watched. The last 2 weeks were the hardest. We barely spoke, barely slept, just worked. Every day we checked our supplies, counted our tools, made sure nothing else had gone missing. One morning we found something on the work site. A single boot, old and torn, caked in dried mud. Not ours. We finished early. By the end of the 5th week, the cabin was done. The client wasn't supposed to come for another few days, but we didn't care. We packed up, loaded the truck, and drove out without looking back. We never talked about it after that. A few months later, I heard that the cabin burned down. No one knew how it started. No one knew if anyone had been inside when it happened. No one asked. I never went back, and I never will. I had never been the type to get scared easily. I had spent years working in remote areas, taking on jobs that required me to be alone for long stretches. Solitude never bothered me. I liked the silence, the sense of being away from the chaos of cities. So when I was offered a job to renovate an old cabin deep in the French countryside, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like an easy task. Fix up the roof, reinforce the structure, replace some old floorboards. A few weeks of work and I'd be done. The cabin belonged to a man named Julian, an older guy who had inherited it from his father. It had been in his family for generations, but years of neglect had left it in rough shape. The location was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, with only a narrow dirt road leading up to it. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, just endless trees stretching out in every direction. The closest town was over an hour away. Perfect, I thought. I could work without distractions. The first day, I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, and the road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a trail cutting through the trees. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just the usual quiet you expect in the woods, but a deeper kind of silence.
No birds.
No rustling leaves, just the wind moving through the trees. The cabin itself was in worse shape than I expected. The wood was old and warped from years of exposure to rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Some of the windows were cracked. The front door had deep scratches on it, like something had clawed at it. I assumed it was just wear and tear, maybe animals trying to get in. Inside, it was dusty and smelled like damp wood. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and there were old pictures on the walls, black and white photos of people from another time. Julian had told me I could stay in the cabin while I worked. There was no electricity, but there was an old wood stove for warmth. I had brought supplies, canned food, a flashlight, a battery-powered lantern, enough to last me until the job was done. That first night, I settled in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night, something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then the footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. Close, too close. I held my breath, listening. The sound didn't continue. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I had imagined it and went back to sleep. The next day, I got to work. I started with the roof, climbing up to remove the damaged shingles. The sun was bright, and for most of the day, everything felt normal. The only strange thing was the constant feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods seemed different, like the trees had shifted slightly. That evening, I sat outside eating a can of cold beans, watching the sun dip below the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no tracks around the cabin. If an animal had been outside my window last night, there should have been tracks in the soft dirt. But there was nothing.
No prints.
No signs of movement. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, something knocked against the side of the cabin. Hard. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing. The days passed, and the feeling of unease only grew. Every night, the noises returned. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. One night, I found the front door open, even though I had locked it. I started working faster, determined to finish the job and leave. But something about the place felt wrong. I kept noticing small things. My tools would be in different places than where I left them. My flashlight disappeared for a full day, only to turn up inside a cabinet I hadn't even opened. The worst night was my last. I had finished most of the work and was planning to leave the next morning. I packed my things, made sure my truck was ready to go. That night, the noises started earlier, louder. I sat on my bed, gripping my flashlight, listening. Then, around midnight, something slammed against the back wall of the cabin. The whole structure shook. I jumped up, heart pounding. The wind outside had died completely, leaving only silence. And then footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the back of the cabin, moving toward the front door. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside, then scratching. Long, slow scratches against the wood. I grabbed my knife, my hands slick with sweat. The scratching stopped, and for the longest moment, there was nothing. Then the doorknob started to turn. I lunged forward, slamming the lock into place. Silence. My breathing was too loud in the quiet. Then faintly laughter. Low, almost a whisper. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I threw my things into my truck and left. I didn't look back. I never told Julian what happened. I finished the work, left my final report, and took my payment. I never went back. A few months later, I got a call from another worker who had been hired to do some additional repairs. I didn't pick up, but he left a message. He had arrived at the cabin, found my work completed. But something was wrong, he said. The front door was wide open. Inside, there were deep scratches on the walls, and on the floor in the dust were footprints.
Bare footprints.
Leading from the door to the bed where I had slept, and then stopping, like someone had been standing there, watching, waiting. It was 2012 when I took the job. A man I barely knew, a friend of a friend, needed help fixing up an old hunting cabin deep in the Oregon woods. The pay was decent and I had nothing tying me down, so I figured, why not? I had done a few carpentry jobs before, enough to get by, and this guy, Daniel, said it would be simple work. Replace some rotting wood, patch up the roof, maybe reinforce the porch. Daniel wasn't coming with me. He gave me the keys, some instructions, and an old pickup to haul my supplies. The cabin was a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and once I turned off the main road, it was another hour down a winding dirt path, trees closing in from all sides. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up was how old the place was. The wood was gray with age, the roof sagged slightly, and the porch looked like one wrong step would send it crashing down. It wasn't abandoned. There were old footprints in the dirt, tire tracks that looked fresh. Someone had been here recently. Inside, the place smelled like damp wood and dust. There was furniture, but everything was old, worn-out couches, a kitchen table covered in scratches, a wood-burning stove with black soot lining the edges. The bedroom had a single bed, the mattress thin and stained. I unpacked my things, set up a small work area, and by evening I had a fire going in the stove. Outside, the woods were quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I tried not to think about how far I was from anyone else. The first few nights were uneventful. I woke up with the sunrise, spent the day repairing the porch, replacing warped planks, and clearing out debris. At night, I made simple meals on a gas stove, read old magazines I found in the cabin, and went to bed early. But by the fourth night, I started hearing things. It wasn't animals. I had grown up in a rural area. I knew the sounds of raccoons, coyotes, even bears. This was different. It started with footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. I lay still, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped near the front porch. I waited, gripping the knife I kept near my bed. Minutes passed. Then, a slow, deliberate knock at the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. No one should be out here. I waited until the fire in the stove died down and the cabin was pitch black. No more footsteps. No more knocks. The next day, I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered onto the porch. Maybe I was just paranoid, being alone in the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt it. The trees felt too still, the air too heavy. On the 7th day, I found something that made my stomach drop. A single boot print, half covered in mud, just behind the cabin. It wasn't mine. It was fresh. Someone had been standing there, watching. I checked the perimeter, found no other tracks leading to or away from it. Whoever left it had been careful. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the darkness, listening. Nothing. Then, around midnight, the noise started again. Not footsteps this time, just breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just outside the cabin walls. I stayed awake until sunrise, knife in hand. The next morning, I decided I needed to leave. But I had one last thing to check. The basement. I hadn't gone down there yet. The door was locked with a heavy iron latch, and I hadn't thought much about it. But now something felt off. I pried it open with a crowbar and descended the wooden steps. The air was cold, damp, thick with the smell of earth. The basement was small, just a dirt floor and wooden walls lined with old shelves. And then I saw it. A pile of old clothes neatly folded in the corner. Men's clothes, dirty, torn, but carefully arranged. Next to them, a small tin cup, a used toothbrush. Someone had been living here. Recently. I backed up slowly, heart hammering. As I turned to run, I saw something else. Deep scratch marks on the inside of the basement door. Long, deep grooves like someone had tried to claw their way out. I didn't pack my things. I didn't lock up. I just ran. By the time I reached the truck, the sun was setting. I climbed in, turned the key, nothing. Dead. Then, from the tree line, movement. A figure standing just beyond the trees. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I jumped out, grabbed the emergency gas can from the back, and ran down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out. It took me hours to reach a gas station, where I called the police. They found the cabin. They found the basement, but they never found him. Just the clothes, the scratch marks, the boot print in the mud. And one more thing. Near the back of the cabin, etched into the wood, were the words, "I watch you sleep." I never planned to stay at the cabin. It was just supposed to be a stop along the way, a place to catch my breath and get some sleep before continuing my trip. But I ended up staying much longer than I wanted. I had been driving across the country, taking the back roads, trying to get away from everything. It was late October, and the cold had started to settle in. The trees were mostly bare, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The roads were empty, the air crisp and dry. I hadn't seen another car in hours. I wasn't even sure where I was exactly. Somewhere deep in the woods, far from any town or gas station. I had taken a wrong turn off the highway and ended up on a narrow dirt road that wound through the forest. My gas gauge was getting low, and my phone had lost signal miles back. Then I saw it, a cabin sitting alone in a small clearing. It looked old but sturdy. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof slightly slanted. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a single wooden chair sitting next to the door. There were no lights, no signs of life, but there was a driveway leading up to it, if you could even call it that, just 2 tire tracks cutting through the grass. I pulled up and killed the engine. I wasn't sure why I stopped. Maybe I thought someone could help me with directions. Maybe I just wanted a place to rest for a while. I got out of the car. The air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Nothing. It was too quiet. Even the birds were silent. I walked up the steps and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked slightly from the force, but still nothing. I tried the handle. Unlocked. I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but I was exhausted. My head was pounding from the long drive, and I hadn't eaten in hours. I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one big room with a bed against the far wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a tiny kitchen area with an old table and 2 chairs. There was a musty smell, like damp wood and dust. A single window let in what little light was left in the evening sky. There were no signs that anyone lived there. No personal belongings, no food in the cupboards, no pictures on the walls. Felt abandoned. But the bed was made. The floor was clean. Someone had been here. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it didn't matter. I just needed a few hours of sleep, and then I'd be on my way. I shut the door behind me, locked it, and sat on the edge of the bed. My body ached from driving all day. I told myself I'd just rest my eyes for a few minutes. I woke up to darkness. The only light came from the moon outside, casting long shadows across the floor. My mouth was dry, my body stiff. I had slept longer than I meant to. Then I heard it, a soft creaking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart started pounding. I sat up, straining to hear. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the old wood settling. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Something scraping came from outside, near the porch. I held my breath. The scraping continued, slow and steady, moving along the wooden boards. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I peered outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the empty road, the dark outline of my car. I waited. Nothing happened. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. I turned away from the window and froze. The door, the lock, it was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I reached out, heart hammering, and slowly turned the knob. Locked. I stared at it, my breathing shallow. Had I imagined it? Had I been too tired to remember? I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The porch looked normal. No signs of anything unusual. But as I walked down the steps, something caught my eye. The ground. There were footprints. Not boot prints. Not shoe prints. Bare feet. Large, misshapen, uneven. The toes too long, the heels too narrow. They led from the woods up onto the porch, and then back into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I ran to my car, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving. I didn't look back. I just kept going until I saw another car, another road sign, another gas station. I don't know who or what was in those woods that night, and I don't ever want to find out.